Alright, hello everyone. So, this is a little bit of a Navia introduction. You already know Mother with the Shades coming through. You see her. But anywho, I got her yesterday, day one. You already know. So, I've been testing a little bit of her, and I've tested her with pretty much every possible unit on my account that I could think of using her for. So, I'm mainly going to go over the units that I tested her with, alongside some other units that I think have some potential with her, but I'm still a little bit unsure of. So this is generally just going to be a first impressions on my end. When I'm talking about these characters, I'm talking about how they function with Navia in terms of her as an on-field DPS, unless I specifically mention a quick swap variant, but for the most part, I'm mainly talking about her as an on-field DPS. So let's go ahead and just get into it. So for this portion of the video, I'm not going to go over the Geo section, because the Geo section is relatively straightforward. So, you know what, screw it. I will actually go over it real quick. So obviously Zhongli is probably going to be the most straightforward second Geo option. Why is he? Anyways, so Zhongli is going to be pretty much the go-to second option in terms of Geo, especially if you're using Navia on Serpent Spine, which, if you know how the stacking mechanic works, basically you don't want to take damage as much as you possibly can. Zhongli's shield effectively makes Serpent Spine stacks easier to maintain, especially if you have max stacks, which in turn of course helps with their damage output, so he's a good second option. If you have Albedo also works, although you give up a little bit less defensive utility, it in turn grants you a little bit more damage and you still get the Geo Resonance, so that's fine. I thought about testing with Yunjin, but then I realized Yunjin's kit just isn't too synergistic with Navia. I mean, at most, you'll do a little bit more damage with your normal attacks on Navia, but like that's not really the brute amount of like where her damage is coming from. So it'll still be a decent damage increase, but in my opinion, it's not significant enough to where I would put her in like an entire team slot over other units like Zhongli or Albedo in the second Geo portion. I did test that with Ningguang a little bit, and I actually kind of liked it a little bit, especially with the fact that I could just swap Ningguang in a team like, for example, Bennett and Jiangling with Ningguang with her on Archaic Petra, and then obviously buffs Jiangling's Pyro, but she also has the Jade screen for Navia to give some extra Geo damage bonus. And obviously this also works with Zhongli if you want to run Archaic Petra, although with Zhongli, in my opinion, I'd rather use Tenacity because it is beneficial overall more rather than Archaic Petra. But with Ningguang, obviously she can't really use Tenacity that effectively, so it's fine to just use her with Archaic in that sense. But regardless, the Jade screen in Archaic Petra is pretty decent. However, I still have a high preference for Zhongli in the second Geo slot, so this is usually my number one option, and if I had Albedo, I would also use him. Alright, so now I'm going to go over characters by order of element. So obviously we have the Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo. And the reason I'm going over these units specifically is in regards to Navia's Ascension 4 passive, which here says for every Pyro, Electro, Cryo, or Hydro party member, she gains a 20% attack increase, and it can stack up to 2 times. So usually you want to do double Geo with like 2 of any of these elements. So it's usually going to be a portion of her better teams. I have tried teams where she is solo Geo, and while they're okay, I do prefer double Geoed and then double whatever, or like 1 and 1 with any of these elements. So that is just my personal preference as far as testing has gone. Of course, this is still only like within the first week, and I still don't even have like her full set. This is in the context of me using things like Gladiators and Golden Troop 2-piece, as well as like Marchesi Hunter when I'm using Farina, which I'll get into in more depth when I go over Farina. But let's go ahead and start with the Pyro cast. So for Pyro, so I currently have Toma equipped in my team, so I guess I'll just cover him first. So Toma, he's an option, not the greatest. I actually, for some God forbidden reason, decided to try Burgeon and Abyss with Navia. It doesn't, I don't know, it felt kind of awkward. It felt good for like the first rotation, but then as time went on in following rotations, it kind of felt a little more awkward to play. So definitely not a team I would really recommend or even suggest in terms of viability. But Toma, just in and of himself as a unit outside of Burgeon and just existing as a defensive utility option, is pretty okay. It's whatever if you want to use him as your defensive utility option, although it's not necessarily the greatest unless you build him like full HP and you have him at high constellations. And his C6 does give Navia a little bit of a damage increase for the normal attacks through her Ascension 1 passive after you cast her skill with her Geo Infusion state, so it's like, okay, it's whatever, but not necessarily a character I'd really recommend too much in Navia teams, but he just exists, and if you want to use him, you can, but nah, it's whatever. Next up is Bennett. Obviously, Bennett a premier power option and just overall a premier buffer option in pretty much almost every Navia team you could think of. Obviously, the flat attack buff that he grants through his elemental burst is really beneficial, and especially if you're someone like me that has Bennett's burst crowned. So like, for example, mine's like a C6 Bennett, and he has a crown burst, so he has level 13, so the attack buff is especially beneficial and very useful for my Navia. So in a context like that, he's a unit that 9 times out of 10 I'm using like pretty much most, if not all, my Navia teams for the most part. And on top of that, of course, he provides healing, and when you're in the context of Farina teams, if you have him a bit more on the healer build type side, it's pretty easy to overflow with this healing or heal to max HP or whatever. So getting fanfare stacks isn't too difficult with him in that context. And overall, obvious, just a premier unit. Xiangling, of course, in the second Pyro slot alongside Bennett, so doing a Bennett Xiangling combo is really effective with Navia. And then if you pair that with like Zhongli or Albedo, I would debatably say this would definitely be one of her better teams. And I'm not sure if this is like her best team, but this is definitely like one of her top 3, maybe top 5 teams with ease. Very reliable application. Obviously, Xiangling's Power NATO does a ton of damage with Bennett's burst activated alongside the Geo Resonance, and in the context of Zhongli, you obviously have the Res Shred on top of that. So overall, just large amount of damage. Also the Power Resonance as well, which benefits pretty much everyone and especially Navia. So overall, these two together, really good combo, and Xiangling just as a unit provides a lot. But of course, with Xiangling, pretty much always want to use her with Bennett, and if you try to use her solo, obviously energy. Yanfei is like, again, same boat as like Toma. The problem with defensive utility options besides Zhongli is that in most cases you are running double Geo, and because you're mainly operating around Crystallize, defensive utility options become a little bit less preferable in your slots, and you usually want to opt for people who either have high levels of application or provide a decent ton of damage, or both. Most of the time, people who are good off-field applicators usually also have a decent amount of damage from off-field, so defensive utility options end up becoming a little bit less priority. And with Yanfei, even if you have her at C4 with her C4 shield, it's there and it's good, but do you really want to be building all of this energy and potentially maybe running Thrilling Tales if you have enough energy for the sake of contributing to her A4 passive when Bennett is like right here with Xiangling, and if you have Zhongli and Aura Beto, you know, like they're just there, and like while she's viable, it's the same thing as Toma. Like they're viable and like you can use them, but like it's nowhere really near recommended unless you just really just feel like doing it. That's just my opinion though. Obviously others might have a different opinion, but that is just my opinion with my experience with testing them and using them in practice. It doesn't feel horrible to use, but it's definitely not as good as like some of the better teams for Navia. So that's just my opinion. Alright, so next is Hydro. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about Zincho. Now Zincho, I mean, he provides a ton of application, does good damage, and especially if you have him at high constellations, and a decent amount of people usually have him at least C2 or higher. So for the most part, he is going to definitely be a good option for the off-field DPS slot in Navia teams. There's nothing more to say. And then of course there's also Yelan. You can use them together for double Hydro, for the resonance, and because they also just benefit each other in many different ways and make up for some of their weaknesses, or I guess lack of utility in certain areas. And especially with Yelan, I actually like Yelan a little bit more, especially because of her, I think it's her Ascension 4's damage bonus increase, which is the ramping damage bonus buff over time. So I think this is especially beneficial for Navia, and she provides enough application to where getting crystallized is still reliable. But of course you can still do both, and it'll be just as effective, if not more effective, in my opinion. In the case of Farina, now Farina is interesting. So in my testing experience, so I've tested her without Bennett and with Bennett. You can definitely do a Bennett Farina Zhongli variation with Navia, and like it works, and it's actually pretty strong. I initially thought when I was like doing pre-TC stuff, oftentimes I kind of just assumed that it would be a little bit difficult to reliably get enough stacks that it makes up for the fact that you're not getting as many fanfare stacks, but because there's Bennett buff and double Geo, that maybe it would make up for it. And at first I thought it wouldn't be enough, but now that I've tested it in practice, my initial assumption was incorrect. It is actually pretty good, and especially because you can run Navia on Marchasi Hunter. I do believe that doing Bennett, Farina, Zhongli is still a fairly strong team. Now outside of Bennett Farina combinations, I did actually try Farina with Charlotte. Now, one of the things that I think I saw in discussions with things like using a Hydro and a Cryo, and especially with like Farina, Charlotte, and then like Zhongli, or like if you didn't do Zhongli and you use like Navia solo Geo with like the last slot being like another Cryo option or a Hydro option. I think a potential issue that people listed out was the freeze reaction messing with the Crystallize. I don't really know how to explain this, but it didn't feel like too much of a hindrance to getting stacks. Like, of course, every now and then enemies were frozen and like maybe I missed out on like getting an extra stack or two, but most of the time I was still able to consistently get at least 3 stacks, and if not, I still managed to get like 4, 5, and even sometimes still 6 stacks, even taking into account things like the frozen reaction being triggered constantly. So at least in my experience from testing in like Abyss and stuff, and I've tried this on like multiple of the Abyss floors too. So this isn't just like floor 12. I tried this on like previous floors too, where there's more AoE and like more freeze potential. It doesn't seem like an issue that is as large as it may have been. I think doing Farina teams like that won't be too much of a hindrance. And especially with like Charlotte, she has a large burst heal, so you can gain max fanfare stacks pretty much instantly. And Navia can gain the full benefits from Farina in this case. So that's still pretty good. Next is Ayato. If you want to use him as a burst support, but he doesn't really provide that much Hydro application off field, and on top of that, all his burst really does in terms of buffing is a normal attack damage buff, so yeah, no. Now next one is C6 Candace. Now I actually haven't tested this one, but I wanted to test it just to see its viability, because I know with C6 her Hydro application is actually pretty reliable, and I mean she just goes from a non-existent unit to like an existing unit at C6, so I mean that's just unfortunately the way Candace works. I still need to do a little bit of testing just to see how viable using her as a Hydro slot is, but I would assume it's just like it's viable and like you can use it type of thing, but definitely not necessarily a recommended option. Next is Kokomi. Kokomi can fit in like the defensive utility slot, have Zhongli, or like if you're using Zhongli but you're against something like, for example, the wolves that apply the corrosion effect and you want that healing but you're not using Bennett maybe, then Kokomi can be that slot. But again, in a lot of Navia teams you probably are going to use Bennett, but if you decide not to use Bennett and you want a defensive utility option that's not Zhongli and that like heals you specifically, then Kokomi with like Thrilling Tales works. And the Thrilling Tales can buff Navia, so that's one upside of doing Kokomi in this instance. A similar thing with Mona, you can do Thrilling Tales with Mona, and on top of that, Mona has her burst that applies a little bit of extra damage bonus for a couple seconds. So I mean, she's good for things like nuking, and if you just want to do some quick quick little screenshot stuff, like boom, I did like 500k with her Navia's elemental skill, boom, then yeah, Mona. And honestly, even outside of that, I mean, you can hold her with Noblesse. It'll also work pretty decently. But I mean, this is just like one of those cases where like it's viable, but like you don't really need to, because I mean, Zincho and Yolan exist, and there's like a bunch of other options that you can select, because you can also do Electro or Cryo units or any other type of unit within the Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo space. So you're not really too restricted with just using Mona. Next is Electro, starting with Yamiko and Fischl. I mean, these are just going to be the premier Electro off-field DPS units for Navia. They provide a decent amount of damage and a decent amount of application that can reliably trigger enough Crystallize for Navia to get at least 3 stacks, and in most cases you can probably even get a little bit more. And I mean, honestly, there's just not too much else to say. Beto is like a nice second option because not only does she provide defensive utility at C1+, but on top of that, she provides some off-field application through her elemental burst, and she has the parry mechanic as well when you're trying to do combat on field with her for a little bit to get the energy, which is overall pretty good, and especially in chambers where there's enemies that are a lot more aggressive and maybe break through crystallized shields super fast. Then Beto in this slot both provides damage application and some defensive utility, so she is a good like solo slot, or if you want to pair as like a second Electro in Navia teams, then she's also a really good option. And then I guess another one is like Raiden Shogun. With Raiden Shogun, I would honestly only do it if you really just feel like being cringe and just run Tenacity and use her as a skill bot. Then I mean, you can do that. You can do that, I guess. But most of the time, you're probably using Zhongli on Tenacity anyways, so like it's not necessary. But if you're not using Zhongli with Tenacity, or like there's nobody else running it, then you can slot Raiden Shogun in for a Tenacity bot and just use her for a skill to proc it. That's it. There is Cookie Shinobu for like healing, but it's Cookie Shinobu and like she just heals, but like it's single target healing and it's kind of whatever. Of course, Bennett also single target heals. So I mean, it's a little unfair to say, but like the problem with Cookie is that like Although she is an Electro unit that contributes to her A4 and she gives some pseudo healing, which is actually fine in Navia teams. Usually Kuki wants to be used in like Hyper Bloom teams, and when you're just using her just for the sake of her healing, it's sort of just like whatever, I guess. But like it's usable, it's fine. There's also Dory, but like who's using this girl? Ain't anybody using her. You actually do have Lisa as an option. I think she has the defense decrease in her burst. I'll write a correction note here if I'm like wrong or if I stated the wrong thing, but I think it's her burst as a defense reduction, and then on top of that you can run Thrilling Tales and Noblesse, so she is that one case where you could do those two things and it'll actually be pretty effective with Navia. There is Kudosara, but she's only here for the attack increase through her skill, and it's kind of just whatever. Don't do it. And lastly, we will talk about the Cryo units. So Shenhe, no, don't. The issue with Shenhe is she's straightforward in telling you that she primarily wants to buff cryo or like physical damage dealers in her kit, and although you do get the increased either normal attack and charge attack or whatever, or like the skill and burst based on the tap or hold skill that you decide to use in her ascension passive, it's not enough to then just like flex slot her in an entire unit slot in a team. And on top of that, her application even with her burst active is a little bit on the slower end, so it's not super reliable for Navia in terms of producing crystallized reactions. If you really wanted to do a double cryo team, you could slot Shenhe as like the second option, but then they would just mainly buff the off-field DPS cryo unit, so something like Kaya or Rosaria. And speaking of Kaya Rosaria, they're of course going to be your premier off-field DPS units for the cryo slot. I actually did enjoy doing Kaya and Rosaria, either doing both of them or just doing one or the other in Navia teams. Actually had a lot of fun doing that, and it works a similar way with double Electro, double Pyro, etc, etc. The application that they both provide is really sufficient. Of course, the downside with their application, and I think especially in Rosaria's case, is mainly just the uptime. It can be a little bit on the shorter end, but honestly it's not too much of a hindrance, especially for Navia, because Navia is fine with just swapping in for a little bit and then swapping out, so it's not too much of a hindrance in my personal experience. For defensive options, you of course have Layla if you really want to, and Layla can kind of swap in for Zhongli if you want to use like Albedo or something. Then if you want like a shielder in like your third slot or something and you feel like you really do need a shielder, then you could use Layla and then use like Tenacity or something on her, and that would work just fine. But again, shielders outside of Zhongli that don't contribute to her Geo Resonance are kind of just whatever, but it's still viable nonetheless. Of course, Diana exists, but honestly, I don't recommend her too much. She's kind of just here. Now, Charlotte I personally only really recommend if you're doing teams like Farina teams. Then Charlotte can be a decent option because for one, both her and Farina give Navia the max bonus for her Ascension 4 passive because the fact that they're Hydro and Cryo. Now, of course, there is the potential issue of things like freeze that I was talking about earlier, but the issue isn't too bad, and even if you had a second Cryo or Hydro option that would make freeze be enabled more often, most of like the Cryo applicators at least aren't like so fast to the point that like it messes with the crystallize so much that like Navia can't even get like at least 3 stacks. Most of the time she'll still be able to get 3 stacks, and if not more still. And of course, when you take into context double Geo, then this issue sort of just doesn't matter too much because I mean, you have the second Geo also taking away the freeze reaction, so like it kind of just helps with making it less of an issue. So there's also that to take into account. But to circle back to Farina teams, Charlotte obviously has her burst heal, and I literally have her 60 out of 70, and I literally have her on Favonius with Noblesse stats, I think, and I have her like ER, attack goblet, and then like a crit circlet, and she still heals enough because her burst heal is just so big that like I still can heal the entire team to full and get max Farina fanfare stacks, especially in like following rotations. Charlotte is just that good at just enabling Farina's fanfare. A pretty good option if you want to slot Farina and you don't feel like running Farina Bennett team combinations, then you can do Farina Charlotte, and Charlotte can run like Noblesse or Tenacity depending on your preference. There's also of course Mika, but Mika is a bit of a weaker option, and he doesn't have really any benefit to Navia specifically, to be honest, aside from running Noblesse and maybe the attack speed buff helping to produce maybe 1 extra crystallized shard, maybe, but yeah, it's sort of just whatever. And Cheongyan, I mean, I haven't tested him, so I'm not really going to comment on him too much, but I would assume he's sort of just there. just whatever. But yeah, that was my overall first impression of units when being used with Navia. Obviously this wasn't necessarily specifically about Navia, but rather in the context of Navia teams. I'll make a more Navia specific video, so like a guide or something after this one. But I wanted to make this one just to share my experience early on in terms of the units that can work with Farina and ones that maybe are viable and can be used, but like maybe aren't as effective depending on the combination. But this still goes to show that Navia has quite a wide selection of options to use in her teams, and I think this makes her overall pretty fun. However, one thing I am going to mention very briefly is not necessarily disappointment, but like I'm not surprised that they went this direction with Navia in terms of the crystallize reaction. And this also goes to show that a Geo rework is more than likely not happening, because now they've basically locked in Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo Geo reactions to just crystallize, and like because of the way Navia's kit works, and like they can't really just casually change characters' kits like that because they could potentially get into some trouble if they do that. So most likely the case, it's gonna be stuck like this for Geo. Still, Navia's a good unit. I enjoy her. She's really fun. Probably some of the most fun I had in quite a bit in terms of units in this game. So I'm very satisfied from getting her and playing her. And of course, I only have her C0, and I only have her talents at like 7, 8, and 6. So I can only imagine once I think I'm gonna crown her skilled in the meantime if I can. But I'm mainly aiming for 999 for my talents, and I'm using Serpent Spine for her, and the performance is still really good, especially in her better teams or when you optimize her teams properly. She does a good amount of damage and the teams work really fine, even in this Abyss where she kind of doesn't struggle, but like it just doesn't pair the best with the way that she works, but she still can like 36 start and like full clear it. So like it's still good. So I'm satisfied. Alright, and that's going to wrap it up. If you did enjoy, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more Genshin Impact content. Leave down some questions for Navia that you have for me down in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them with anything like updates or just any additional questions that you have or anything specific. I will answer them as quickly as I possibly can. And until the next video, bye-bye.